Awesome. Morning, everybody. Yes, as Keith said, if you were here this time last year, you saw part one of this. And clearly it didn't go down too badly because they've let me come back. One bit of feedback, actually, that I received on last year's talk was along the lines of, yeah, it was great, but it was probably better if you were there, and it felt a bit like you had to have been there to know what we were talking about. And I kind of sort of apologise for that, but not really, because I'm trying to make this interesting if you weren't there. But if you were, you'll probably remember some of this. So previously at UK North 34, I was talking about what did the ISPs of the day offer, or typically what EUNet and PSINet offered. How did they do it? Whose kit did they use? And did it work for varying values of work? This time round, infrastructure. There's a lot of bias on the links here, I'm afraid, because I happened to work for the links at the time, which was great fun. I'm not sure whether Keith would agree with that wholeheartedly, but what infrastructure was there, what buildings were there, how did all of this stuff glue together, and how much fun we all had. Again, there's a recurring theme, isn't there? But a brief aside, digital archaeology is really hard work. Some of you might recognize that picture as appearing on Facebook a week or so ago. When I went and rummaged in the office fire safe, I found all sorts of old rubbish, including a backup tape from, I think that's August 98, from one of the Linksys servers in London, a backup tape from one of the Linksys servers in Peterborough, and a jazz disk. Keith loved jazz drives for backups of one of them. I think it was London again. Unfortunately, when it actually came to finding a drive, that was easy. I could find a DDS3 drive and learnt about the backwards compatibility of DDS devices. The tapes didn't really want to play. The fact that it took 48 seconds and lots of interesting noises to work out that it didn't want to play was another interesting point. But if there's stuff you're doing today and you think that it might be interesting in 10 or 20 years' time, this is actually quite serious, because these were, the standard backup media of the day, and we can't easily read it now. The only reliable data storage device that I've had through all of this, for last year's talk and this year's, is my 1993 vintage SCSI 1 IBM 1 gig hard drive, which is as slow as anything. Sounds like it's got sand in its bearings, but has replayed data every time I've asked it to. So, anyway, whoops. We don't have an outage. So on to the links. Now, I did one of those things that you should never, ever, ever do in this industry, and I made some rash prediction in the links office in around 1998. The links had about 50 members at the time. In my defense, at the time, the links did not have the sort of membership that it has today in terms of the type of members. It was very much the big ISPs and nobody else. There were no content providers due to the links joining rules, which we'll come back to. And hey, Thomas Watson said there was a market for 5 computers worldwide, so I think I'm in reasonable company. As far as interconnection went, exchange points really were few and far between. There were the 2 Mays in the US, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. These were not like European exchanges, though. These were very much commercial entities, as is the want of US providers. And they sort of struggled along for a bit, but they're no longer with us. In Europe, you had the choice of NetNode, Links, and AMSIX. That was basically it. Now, I'm sure that I'm going to have forgotten somebody who was around in Europe at the time. This is sort of mid-1998, so please don't lynch me. Everything was expensive, whether it was a Links membership, whether it was a T3 across the Atlantic. Everything you did was ridiculously expensive by today's standards. So what did the links look like back in 1998? Well, this is sort of mid-98. It was present only in Telehouse North. That's mainly because Telehouse East, West, and North 2 were still car parks. The data center explosion was, I'd say that they were well in the process of being built around now, but they weren't ready for action. So more of that later. So the links consisted at the time of 7 switches. There were 2 Catalyst 5000s, 2 Planetree 4800s. Now, anybody who's heard me talk about these switches before will know that the only way I once got some action out of Planetree was to threaten to invite the computing press and throw them off the roof of Telehouse into the moat. They were ideal for the job they did briefly, I will say. That's the best praise I can give them. They worked fine in the lab. I remember testing them well at Colt's facilities, thank you, Neil, and they worked fine there, but when we deployed them, they had some issues. And 3 Catalyst 1200s. Now, these were not, you know, well, they were cutting edge at the day, but now they're kind of, you know, well, also rounds. They were all connected by FDDI. Yes, woohoo. There was, I'll come back to that in a minute. So this was actually switch0.links.net. You can see that it had a whole bunch of 10 meg ports. That's what those, I do have a laser here. I can shoot you. It had these sort of bulk Amphenol connections for 10 meg ports. It had 2 FIDI ports and a row of 100 meg ports along the bottom. And there is a Catalyst 1200. This is actually switch 1, which is now in the Science Museum. And so annoyed by this was Cisco that one of their devices was going in a museum. They refused to turn up when we handed it over. And this is actually a Planetree 9600 because I couldn't find a picture of a 4800, but it was half the size of this and contained mainly FIDI ports. Thankfully, because I couldn't get anything off tapes, I found one of Keith's Nanog presentations from January 1999, which had this very handy diagram of the links at the time. And if you can't see it very easily, there's basically an FDDI ring here, down the bottom, and then 2 smaller rings at the top. That was pretty much the best interconnect technology that we had at the time. There was also one particular Links member who shall remain nameless, who had a presence on the board. And Alex insisted that we kept FDDI because he relied on it for some of his connectivity. So that's, we were stuck with this for a few years yet. But this clearly didn't scale very well. We had 100 meg interconnects. We had 100 meg connected customers, or members. They weren't customers back then, they were definitely members. And obviously this led to a problem. So we had to do something. Traffic-wise, I've forgotten this slide was here, sorry. Traffic-wise, about 300 meg average traffic. So, you know, having 100 meg interconnects was an issue, 53 members, and 9,000 routes out of 55,000, so sort of just under 20% of the routing table. You'll note a small dip around the beginning of November that we'll come back to. The links joining process, as I alluded to, was a little bit, I think the word convoluted and somewhat counterproductive is a fair assessment of it. There was this requirement that you had to provide 3 trace routes to root name servers that didn't go through any other links member's network. What this effectively did, though, was it made the current links members a cartel that kept everybody else out. It excluded content providers who didn't have their own international network, and it excluded the smaller ISPs who would just buy transit from someone larger. And this kind of led directly to the formation of LONAP. And back then, there was quite a lot of animosity between Links and LONAP, I think it's fair to say, which thankfully we don't have anymore. The exchanges all cooperate very well with each other. And I think in general, as an industry, it's fantastic because we're all in competition, yet we're all in great cooperative competition. And you know, venues like this and exchanges of information like this is proof of that, and we should all be really quite proud of that. So we had to do an upgrade to a gig because 100 meg wasn't good enough. So we looked at 1 gig switches, and there were a number of switches in the running, and we elected to go with Packet Engine's PowerRail switches and Extreme switches. Now the PowerRail switches were superb for 2 good reasons. One, they had these nice yellow stripes which offset the Extreme purple really quite nicely. And 2, actually they had a really good chipset. It was a bit of a shame that they were basically acquired by Alcatel, and that range withered a little on the vine, because from a chipset perspective, and I spent a long time talking to their technical folks, they could do things at a hardware level fully programmatically that, you know, was streets ahead of its time, which is a real shame. And that was the first PowerRail 5200 at Links. It's there installed. You can tell I didn't install that because it looks neat. I suspect that was one of Jerry's bits of installation work. And that's the first summit that we had at the Links, Switch 7. And that particular switch was present in my house LAN up till a few years ago, still working quite nicely. So they were definitely built for longevity. So FDDI gave us some inherent protection. These were dual attach, dual rings. GigE didn't have this, and there was quite a large debate about whether we should run spanning tree. And as was our wont occasionally in the office, Keith and I would have a full and frank exchange of technical viewpoints. These were usually punctuated by other members of the Link staff hiding down sort of over their keyboards, pretending to work furiously, while Keith and I rather bluntly explained to the other why we thought their view was perhaps not optimal. This did lead, though, to generally anything between 5 minutes and half a day of sulking for both of us, and then reluctantly agreeing that the other person had quite a good point, and we moved on. There was good architectural compromise, and I think that's very true of any group of techies. I think anybody in here, if we asked how do you do something, we'd get at least 20 different answers. So the initial migration, it wasn't a great success. For that first weekend of November, remember the blip in the stats, there were long nights of packet loss filled days and a number of issues both with the network that didn't show up during testing and member connections, the usual suspects. Auto-negotiation wasn't auto-negotiating. People who were fixed at 100 megs suddenly found themselves trying to go down to 10. It was the sort of thing where however hard you test it in the lab, reality bites and causes no end of trouble. And it was also the sort of problems where we're all very well aware of, you think you've fixed it only to find that it's come up somewhere else a couple of hours later. So this maintenance work and the downtime made the UK national press. I think it was one of the first times it did. I think it was the Telegraph. I did try and find a copy of the article but couldn't find it. It made the national press, but I was really quite irked that it didn't actually make the tech newsletter of the day, sort of Need to Know, which sort of a precursor of the Register. So that's the 6th of November 1998, if you can't read the date on that email, proving that I really should clear out my sent mailbox occasionally. To be fair, this was found in an archive folder. In all seriousness, actually, this problem underlined a real recurring theme about layer 2 switching at exchange points. Switch vendors were really wedded to the view of you would have a switch and you'd have a server plugged in and you'd have lots of clients. Or you'd have a switch at the top of a rack in a computer room and there'd be lots of servers and there'd be an uplink. The very meshy many-to-many flow that exchange points presented to switches showed up shortcomings very, very quickly, especially with the Catalyst 5000s, actually. I'm not just blaming Cisco here. I think all vendors have had these problems on and off. But it certainly was why we were kind of forced into this upgrade faster than perhaps we wanted to, was because we were getting to the stage where you'd go, well, this switch doesn't work, and the default response would be to RMA everything in it. It's like, that's not actually going to fix the problem, guys. And so, yeah, new hardware was very urgently needed. A little bit more fun that we had at the Links was around IP addressing. So, like all small exchanges, back in 97 or so, there was a /23 of PI space that was split neatly between the peering LAN, the server's LAN. I think Keith had some space at home and there was some space elsewhere. So we did what all perfectly respecting providers did, or anybody could do back then, of course, still, was become a ripe LIR and got this whacking great /19. If only we knew what we knew now, we'd have all got far more. This was carved up, and we did the first great renumbering. I think the first great Links renumbering was early 1999. Obviously, there's been a recent great Links renumbering away from what I'm about to describe. But what I found, which was quite interesting, and you might not be able to read this, but it's my original text file where I cut up the 195.66.224 subnet. And what it actually clearly shows is that I'd reserved a /21 for the two peering LANs from day one, so I can only blame the second great renumbering on people who came after me. So all the apologies I gave in the bar that night, it wasn't my fault. It was one of the few things that wasn't. Lynx also hosted some key infrastructure. This was the original, or one of the two original k.rootservers.net machines. Now, I couldn't find a picture of this that didn't have a jar of Marmite on the top, and I'm not even going to begin to explain the jar of Marmite now because it's simply too painful. So that was one of the k.roots, and we also hosted ns0.nic.uk, which was clearly a hand-me-down machine from PSINet. I can tell that due to the fact that it's a cheap Spark clone with those horrible Articon drives. Having these key name servers was actually quite interesting because you saw stats from them. The actual bandwidth stats they used at the time was quite low. So if you think 2 meg, just under 1% of the Lynx's total from k.root outgoing, and probably a tenth of that outgoing from NS0. What was quite interesting, and I did a detailed talk on this, I think, at one of the IETF meetings, but I couldn't find my slides, was doing a TCP dump, for operational reasons, of course, of the type of queries and responses. And a snapshot that we've got of 100,000 queries every 10 minutes from August 98 to k.root showed 19% of requests led to an NX domain. And most of them were things like workgroup. From Windows machines. And 6% of queries came from 1918 space. There's two observations we can make from that 20 years later. One is I very much doubt it's got any better. And two, what on earth is adding all the extra GTLDs done to these people with their Windows domains that are now probably getting completely spurious responses? So the other thing that happened around this time was that the Lynx moved from just being in Telehouse to what is now Bonington House. It was Redbus Interhouse back then on Mill Harbour. It's now Digital Realty, LHR 19, and the Lynx got a suite in there before the building was ready. I think the building actually only went live a year or so later, so we were very early adopters, and got dark fibre between there and Telehouse North. Now, of course, today that sounds like really easy and what anybody would do. Back then, it sparked off a great big debate as to whether the Lynx was competing with its customers, stroke members, whether it was the right thing to do at all, and there were people going, oh, we don't need to be in two buildings, but obviously it's the right model, and all the exchanges are now in multi-building. Depending on who you ask, either the Lynx or the AMSIX claim they went multi-site first, so I've decided to be diplomatic here and say they both happened at about the same time. Talking of data centres, there wasn't really much choice either. London was pretty thin. There was Telehouse North, but still the vast chunk of Telehouse North was dealing room disaster recovery space. There was the infamous TFM1 and TFM2, which looked as bad back then as they do now. There were assorted other TFM and DFM suites around the building, but still I would say more than 50% of the building was disaster recovery space. Telehouse Metro had opened the year before in the city, and 98, I've said, Redbus were building out. They didn't really open until the following year. I know when we moved our kit in, they were still definitely kitting out the floors. And it didn't get much better when you went elsewhere. Up here in Manchester, there was the original Telecity Williams, but data centres as we know them now were few and far between. They were still very much sort of single occupancy computer centres rather than data centres as we know them today, which is one of the reasons why everything was so expensive and difficult to do. Connectivity was its own issue. I touched on this last year, but Ethernet hadn't won the default standard race. In terms of people's WAN links, ATM, frame relay, packet over SONET, they were all still used a lot. The links actually gave, I think it was either 2U or 4U of colo space that came free with a membership, so that you could put a router in the Lynx's suite if you just had a WAN circuit coming in from somewhere else. That's how non-Ethernet we were back then. Typical speeds for backbones were probably 155 meg up to 622 meg, depending on which bit of your backbone you were looking at and how fast you were as a provider. And 2 meg or lower was customers. I mean, there were some places that still were using E1s, 2 meg circuits for part of their backbones. And even on the LAN, Ethernet and IP weren't a given. As I've mentioned, FDDI was still very much in use. Token Ring was in use, but both of these were expensive, but were reliable. And on the LAN protocol-wise, you could come across IPX, you could come across AppleTalk. In fact, you could come across a lot of those protocols so loved by CCIE question setters that thankfully have mostly fallen out of iOS by now. And finally, there were a few interesting light-hearted moments, as always. One tip I'll give Exchange Points is a surefire way of embarrassing your membership into tidying themselves up is to do a presentation like this, but have another screen running a TCP dump of the peering LAN for non-IP or non-ARP traffic. You've got to make sure the MAC addresses are big enough so people can actually see it's their router. But you notice at the beginning of your presentation, it's going up the screen quite quickly. There's quite a lot of furious typing going on in the room. And then at the end of your presentation, it's dropped to maybe, one packet every few seconds. You think, this is really good. And you think that this is the end of the curve, and you're never going to get those people to tidy things up. Good exchange point hygiene comes with good clue, I think, is the thing to take away from there. And there were some other really interesting stories. Keith's probably waiting for this one to come up. There was a member of the Lynx who shall remain nameless and didn't stay as a member much long after this came to light. But this member was caught building GRE tunnels over other members' connections to the US. The explanation given to this was that I'd plugged a Cat5 cable into the wrong port during maintenance a few weeks prior to this, and apparently this had magically caused the router to send the packets out of the wrong port. We hosted the RIPE 31 meeting in Edinburgh. The connectivity was provided by Lynx in terms of the IP connectivity via a GRE tunnel carried over Janet, and there's a full table. What was a bit curious was that the next hop to the neighbour for the BGP in London was learnt via this peering session. None of us can quite remember how this router was bootstrapped, but none of us dared restart it. And I can't find its config anywhere. I can remember that the host name was greatunclebulgaria.links.net, but no amount of grep or find has been able to help me out here. And there was another outfit that caused some trouble towards the end of 1998. There was a company that was trying to basically capitalize on both the Lynx and the Telehouse name, causing consternation to both of them and engagement in a lot of lawyers. I'm not sure whether Lynx had the trademark on the Lynx name at this point, but this definitely caused a lot of head scratching and running around and phone calls. And it's not often that you'll hear me say this, but thankfully PSINet rode to the rescue and came along and bought them out, thus making the name and the problem go away. But that project is a story for another year. Any questions? Oh, and the Lynx marketing department loved this logo so much that I had to use it.
Don't forget to credit Kevin Hoadley with the original logo design.
Yeah, that's true, yes.
Any questions for Paul?
Before I run away.
Okay, okay, at the back there, we'll get two or three questions at the back.
And
we'd love to have more history presentations, so if there's any more old farts out in the room there, then please do.
We don't have a monopoly on old farts.
Curtis.
Oh, God.
Curtis Linkbridge from Links. I actually want to point one thing out, well, one joke and one more serious. One joke is you forgot DPT and SRP on the technologies used at exchange points. Not at Links though, but anyway. Another note is that actually Links still only has members. There is no customers.
Yes, indeed.
So just to clarify that. We haven't changed that bit. There's other parts of the MOU have changed, but not that bit.
Yes, that's my bad, sorry.
Hi, David Friedman from Clarinet. Not so much a question, but more a sort of memory. We joined the Lynx as Dirkon and as Clarinet in the 90s. And when we joined, we received a paper certificate. Yes. Does anybody in the room still have their paper certificate, or were a member of Lynx back at that time? Somebody else, Neil's got his hand up. You got 3? Okay.
There's always one who's greedy.
I've got a few. I'm just wondering what to do with them. I mean, their sort of ink is running on them a bit now. eBay.
Send it back in for a refund, I think.
That's it for me, thanks.
Okay, did we have any other questions at the back there? Okay, thank you, Paul.
Less of early for good behavior.